Hello, everyone. A new installment of A Citizen Speaks, and welcome again as a reminder of why this site is called A Citizen Speaks. Uh, my last name in Hungarian is Polgar, Polgar, which means a citizen, and it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but that's enough. It's not an uncommon name in Hungary. It's not as common as Smith, which in Hungarian is Kovács, but it's still relatively common. There are quite a few people that some of them are well known, like the famous chess player sisters, the Polgar sisters, and there are others. There were a playwright and that was successful in the late 19th, early 20th century in Austria and Vienna. His last name was Polgar. So there are quite a few people with that name. The point is, and they're even here in the United States, there are a couple of people, I've found a couple on the website. The point is that I'm trying to provide some ideas and opinions at a time when there's a lot of really upsetting, confusing, and some ways scary things happening in the world. And one of the most recent ones, and I'll put the connection on, I saw a video of a recording of an interview with an FBI agent who calls himself a whistleblower, and he describes how the FBI and the CIA, two of the major intelligence organizations, one of course dealing with domestic problems or domestic crime, and the other one with international intelligence, they call it. Of course, it has to do with spying, in other words. The reason I wanted to get back to this is because of some of the things that this man has said. And it's worth watching his video because it's pretty scary what he talks about. He points out that Comey, when he was interviewed to be part of the FBI, he admitted that he had been a member of the Communist Party, the member of the Communist Party of the United States. And when they asked him if he was still a communist, he said, well, he didn't know where for sure. Imagine this man who eventually became the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, admitted to having been a member of the Communist Party and didn't know whether he was still in it or not. It's scary beyond belief when somebody actually comes out and says something like that, owns up to that. And he's not the only one. I mean, don't forget, of course, he appointed a lot of the people that were under him. But what this reminded me of was my many years working in the CIA. I worked there for 6 years. And trust me, it took 6 years out of my life that I would like to have back. One of the things that was interesting in that period when I was working for the FBI was something is wrong with the focus. Oh, is that better? Okay. I was considered for a position as an analyst. I was working in a section of FBI called the Foreign Broadcast Information Service. That is a completely open source portion of the FBI. You don't have to lie about where you work. You can admit that you were an employee of the CIA. I'm sorry, the FBI. I meant to say the CIA. You could admit that you were an employee. Because the Foreign Broadcast Information Service basically it's a leftover from the Second World War, when they decided that reading the various publications and listening to the radio propaganda that was provided by the Nazis and the fascists in Italy and other countries who were fighting against the United States, Japan also, they figured that looking at the open sources, there were some important bits of information that could be gathered and certain conclusions can be drawn about what was going on in these various countries and what the people who were running the countries, the dictators, what they were thinking and what kind of possible conflicts that may have existed between the various factions. So that institution, after the Second World War, when the CIA was created, that was in 1948, 49, that it is was maintained, and it became an enormously large institution where there were offices all over the world. At every CIA station, they had a foreign broadcast information office and an officer that was responsible for gathering the information, and they were providing lots and lots of material for all kinds of services. Everybody could subscribe to it. It was not something that was restricted to any kind of security requirements because it was open source. So anyway, the point is that I worked there. I think it was roughly 3 years, 3 years of the 6 that I worked at the CIA. And at one point, I was considered for promotion or movement up to an office called the Foreign Broadcast Information Analysis Office, where the analysts were taking the material that was being collected by all the people from all over the world and writing analyses of what was going on. And I'd done a lot of writing, so they knew that, and actually I published some of the things, so they were aware of that, and they interviewed me. Now the interesting thing was that the person that was responsible for interviewing me, she didn't do it all herself, but she was the one in charge, was the head of this analysis section of the Foreign Broadcast Information Service. It was sort of the highest level of the office because they were the people that were there. Much of the things that they wrote were immediately sent to many of the important offices in various government agencies and also some other places that subscribe to the material. And they asked me to provide a summary of the open source publications that I thought were important in Hungary. Now, this was in 1985, 86, something like that, 85, 86. So it was pretty close. It was all like 3 or 4 years away from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and of course, even less from the collapse of communism in Hungary and other East European countries. Those of us who were working on this kind of material, and I'd been working in the same topic at Radio Free Europe in Munich. In Munich, I was doing it similarly, but it wasn't the same kind of operation. It was smaller. It was less close to the center of the intelligence, quote unquote. But the idea was the same. We were following all of the publications, the open source publications that were available either in writing or in the radio. And we had every day at Radio Free Europe, we received a typed summary of everything that was said on the Hungarian radio station. Okay, anything, of course, that had to do with some news or something, not the other stuff. So I've been following this for many years. I started at Radio Free Europe in 1979. So by 1986, I'd been already in it for 7 years. So I was pretty familiar with what was going on in these open source publications in Hungary. So when this person, this director of this analysis office, asked me to write an analysis of what were the important publications that should be followed in Hungary, I listed, of course, the big publications that were all run, of course, or supervised by the Communist Party in Hungary, the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, as they were called, under János Kádár. And they included newspapers like Népszabadság, which is People's Freedom. These names are always scarily ominous. People's Freedom was the major party of the publication of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. Then there were supposedly non-party papers like Magyar Nemzet, which is Hungarian Nation, that was supposed to be the publication of the Popular Front, which was a purely fictitious organization created sort of as a body to pretend that communists were not in control of everything, even though of course they were. And then there was the Népszava, which is the People's Voice, which was supposedly the publication of the unions, the labor unions, and Magyar Hírlap, which was a Hungarian basically newspaper, which was supposedly the voice of the government. So these were the four major publications, and there were lots of smaller ones, ones that were monthly publications, and there were, of course, there were radio programs, regular daily news programs and analysis programs. So I listed all of these. I went into why it was important to follow the Communist Party daily, the Népszabadság, the People's Freedom, and all the other ones, and described what their roles were and what their supposed connections to various organizations were. So I did that, and I was given enough time and certainly enough space, so I filled a couple pages describing these. But when I came to the end of this, since I'd already been since 1981, I started doing it in 1981, I started analyzing the samizdat publications that were coming out in Hungary. And the samizdat is actually a Russian word that describes publications that were not legal, that were not officially published, and they were obviously banned by the communists in the Soviet Union, and of course eventually in Hungary too, and the other countries. But by 1981, these had multiplied all over everywhere. Poland, there are a lot of them in Poland. There were even ones in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at the time. There were many of them in Soviet Union and Russia, and some very famous people had written in the Soviet publications, some of whom were eventually put into the Gulag. And some of them ended up, Sharansky, for instance, ended up in Israel. There were quite a few well-known, famous people, writers and poets and political analysts who were not part of the Communist Party who wrote in these samizdat publications. And of course, in Hungary, when they started up in 1981, again, there was a period earlier, right after 57, after the defeat of the 1956 uprising, the revolution. There were a number of publications, and many people were either brought into questioning by the secret police in Hungary, the state security service, as they called them, or they were even, some of them were even imprisoned for a period of time. But by this time in 1981, all of a sudden the samizdat publications burgeoned. And those of us who had been following it, and there were quite a few people at Radio Free Europe, and of course at CIA's Foreign Broadcasting Information Service office, we kind of noticed this, and we knew that something was going on, that this was not just an ordinary event in the history of communism, in the whole history of the communist empire under the Soviet Union. People taking chances and often endangering their lives in the sense of jobs and security. Okay, writing things that exposed many of the problems, exposed the inner workings of the party, even sometimes brought to light meetings of the Central Committee that nobody was supposed to know about. Somehow or other, they managed to get a hold of it because they had some connections in the party too. So I wrote that this material, this intelligence material, this samizdat material was terribly important, had to be particularly observed, because even though it was not part of the official publications of Hungary or of any other countries, but in this case I was only talking about Hungary, it gave some sort of an indication of something going on in these countries, or in this particular case in Hungary, that was not usual, that was not the way it had been for the previous 10, 15 years, 20 years. I felt, as so many other people had been watching it along with me, that somehow or other this was a portent of something to come. Something was happening in Hungary and also, of course, in Poland. And of course, by this time, the Polish strikes and the Solidarność movement had already come to life. It was, by 1981, this was already very much in part of the scene. And by the way, one of the reasons the Hungarians stepped up this samizdat publication was because of what was going on in Poland. So there were these things all were adding up, and we didn't know where it was going, because none of us could pretend to be able to see into the future. But we knew that something was up, that something was pretty seriously wrong in the Soviet Empire. And I wrote a couple paragraphs, not too much, but it was at the end of what I wrote about all the other papers. And I handed it in, and I said my goodbyes and went back to the other office where I worked a couple floors below. Well, interesting enough, in a couple of days, my supervisor at the office where I was working called me in to talk to me. He said, Steve, I have to tell you something. It's pretty important. I got a note from upstairs that they did not accept you as an analyst. And then I was not surprised. That sort of part of me was sort of expecting it. But then after I left, and he was very polite, he was very friendly. He was a decent guy. He was not an aggressive bureaucrat. He tried to help people. He was a pretty upstanding man. But he didn't tell me a lot of details. But I knew a lot of people that worked upstairs in this analysis department. And through some other channels, I found out that they had this woman who was in charge of this office. And as I say, this was one of the more important offices of the CIA. It was used by a lot of people, even the people that were only concerned with classified documents. Even they used this material. And this woman warned my supervisor, again, I found out from somebody, I don't remember how, watch this guy. That's what she said. Watch this guy. Be careful of him. And I said to myself, interesting. Why do they have to watch me? What did I do that was in any sense jeopardizing the interests of the U.S. government or any of its leaders or any of its political institutions? I didn't criticize anything. I didn't say anything negative about the U.S. government. All I said was I tried to describe the events that were going on in Hungary and the possible changes that were coming that we couldn't yet interpret. And remember, this was in 1981, and by 1989, one communist country after another basically kicked out the communists or introduced multi-party democracy in elections. So this wasn't that far away. So I talked to some friends of mine. I had one particular friend who knew a lot about what's going on in Hungary. He lived in New York. He had worked in Hungary many years, and he was also at Radio Free Europe with me. He actually helped me get the job. His name was Thomas Carey. And he and I discussed it, and he said, so it sounds like somebody's working for somebody that they're not supposed to be working for. And I said, ooh. So I said to him, I sort of imagined to myself, who is this woman? Whose interest is she serving? She's the head of one of the major offices that is in the CIA. And she is watching out for whom? Whose interest does she represent? And I obviously couldn't answer that question, but boy, did it look suspicious. And to this day, I believe that in some way, this woman had been influenced by somebody. Now, where the influence came from, whether she was paid for it or how she was handled, I have no idea. But that was the beginning of when I began to see that the CIA was far, far from the institution it was supposed to be. It was not representing and safeguarding the interests of the United States. There were some other goals and some other ideas going on among some of the leadership. And this particular person was certainly a leader. Then there were many other instances. This was just one of them. This was the most extensive one. I had some other ones. I talked to a couple of the old timers just before they left the CIA. And they described to me some of the things that had happened and how the CIA had been undermined, among other things, by the Church Commission. It was very famous. It was all over the newspapers. They attacked them for various things, some of which there may have had some small basis in accuracy when they were talking about, getting rid of some of the opponents like Castro and other people. But again, the details are not clear, because if somebody wrote down some plan of how to get rid of Castro, that didn't necessarily mean that that was going to happen. So there are lots of people at the CIA, like any of these large agencies, sit around there and have not much else to do. They're writing papers all the time. And somebody wrote a paper saying, well, we could send Castro a bomb built into a cigar. I mean, just an example, okay? And we could kill him. That didn't mean that anybody was actually going to go through with it. But of course, when it came to the Church Commission started asking questions of the CIA director, who, by the way, was a very decent and honest man, and try to be open and answer all the questions. And of course, it ended up hurting him more than it hurt anybody else. And of course, it hurt the CIA because it led to a lot of this sort of changes in the way that the organization was being run and the kinds of people that were put in charge of running it. That was the CIA. Then later on, when I left the CIA, finally I had the sense and the blessing of some greater power that led me out of there, knowing that I would live a lot longer if I didn't stay there. Then I worked as an interpreter and translator from the outside, an independent contractor, and I was still accepted because the FBI hired me. And I worked for the FBI at the FBI's training center in Quantico, which is the other side of the Quantico Marine base, and I helped them train a lot of Hungarian policemen who they were bringing out after the fall of the communist regimes, and they were trying to teach them some of the techniques, policing techniques that are used in the United States. And so I was involved with working with those people. And of course, I needed to have a certain degree of security clearance because they wouldn't have let me work in the FBI. And there were, again, many different kinds of people there. I met some old timers. Some of them had various problems, had for various reasons. But they were pretty honest and they were straightforward. And they told me, they sort of indicated some of the things that were beginning to happen. They weren't anywhere near as bad as they are today. But the initial signs were there. Just like with this woman at the CIA, there were signs even at the FBI. Certain people were doing things that didn't completely look right. And why were they doing it? Why were they questioning things? Why were they making things harder for the FBI agents who were all of them, the ones that I knew at my level anyway, were hard-working policemen, and they were like trying to detect facts and information about people who tried to undermine the American system somehow. They had to be domestic. Okay, of course, that's the time when they started to develop a foreign connection because of all this connection with the various police departments in Hungary, the Czech Republic, first the Czechoslovakia, then eventually Czech Republic, Slovenia, Poland, and Romania, and so on, because they were trying to help them and, of course, influence them to go in a different direction, helping them get away from their communist past, the past 60 years. So anyway, there were lots of interesting things going on. The point is, even this is 1981. 81, that's a long time ago. That's now 41 years ago. 41 years ago, the signs were there that this was beginning to happen. And of course, this friend of mine, Tomasz, and I had talked a long time, even before then, when I was at the Radio for Europe, because Radio for Europe was completely infiltrated by especially European social democrats. Now, social democrats are socialists. I don't care. The Democrat doesn't change the fact that they're socialists, and that they were very sympathetic in many ways to the Hungarian communists because they were just a little bit further to the left of their positions. So it was obvious when I was at Radio for Europe from 79 to 83 that something was going on, that these people were sort of building up this structure inside agencies like the Radio for Europe, and eventually, of course, at the CIA. And then, of course, I found out at the CIA, because when I left the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, then I went to the Office of Training and Education. Now, that was much more secretive because there I couldn't come out and admit that I was working there. And I can't talk about a lot of things that happened there because that was, I could get into trouble just for even mentioning. But there were many indications there. And I met a couple of people there who had, again, been with the agency for a long time. Some of them, one particular one, a very high-level person, a couple of high-level people, they knew a lot about what had happened in the CIA in the previous 10, 15 years. They'd been involved in some of the most serious operations. And they were pretty serious people. They were not fly-by-nighters, and they were not. But in contrast to them, there came a new cadre of totally self-serving bureaucrats who had no understanding of anything else except how they could be promoted. And that's when I began to see that it was time for me to get out of there. And thank God I found a way out. It made my life in some ways easier, but in some ways harder. Nevertheless, at least I was not in there while these people were undermining the very system that they were supposed to protect. So if you liked my presentation, like the other ones, please subscribe. I appreciate the subscriptions. Anybody has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. I'm trying to put together the necessary papers and requirements to help you promote or help me if it's possible. And I will make that available. And anybody wants to subscribe, I'll be happy to have subscriptions. I will provide you written material if you subscribe, and I will give you a lot more details that you can use if you're interested in if you do subscribe. So thank you for listening, and hope you come back again. Bye-bye.